Without Brian, the Beatles moved in two new directions. In the absence of a manager, they decided to form a company, Apple, to bring all their business affairs under one roof and to expand into new areas. The idea was that they'd have their own record label, as well as all sorts of other enterprises. They bought a headquarters in Savile Row, and their first venture was a boutique in Baker Street. The Beatles were innocents in the business world. All four were hugely enthusiastic about Apple and spent a fortune kitting out the Savile Row building with a recording studio, luxurious furnishings and fittings, drinks cabinets in every room, and so on. But no one around them had much more business acumen than they did. They employed a large staff, including several old friends, who had no idea what they were supposed to be doing. The Beatles would turn up regularly for meetings in high spirits about their new company, but little would get done. Meanwhile, John and George had agreed to go to the Maharishi's ashram in Rishikesh, at the foot of the Himalayas in India, to study meditation. Patty and I would go too. Paul, Jane, Ringo and Maureen were less convinced about the joys of meditation, but decided to join us. The trip was planned for February 1968, and we would stay for 2 or 3 months. On Christmas Day, Paul and Jane got engaged. We were delighted because we loved Jane. George and Patty had married quietly without any of us there, almost 2 years earlier in January 1966. Now the last Beatles couple was to tie the knot. We knew that Paul hadn't found it easy to be with such a successful girlfriend. Like the other Beatles, he was essentially an old-fashioned Liverpool man who wanted his woman tucked away at home, cooking the dinner and minding the kids. Jane was never going to fit that mould. She travelled for her work almost as much as Paul did, and had her own life. She wasn't willing to wait around for him, and at times she was away working when we were all together. But Paul loved her. We knew that, and we were glad that they had worked things out. Despite my increasingly strong feelings that John was slipping away from me, he was off drugs and seemed almost like his old self. "We can make it work, Cyn," he said. "When we're in India, we'll have time for us and everything will be fine." I hoped he was right. A few days before our departure, we had a meeting with the Maharishi's assistant at a house in London to finalise details of the trip. As we entered the main room, I saw, seated in a corner armchair, dressed in black, a small Japanese woman. I guessed immediately that this was Yoko Ono. But what on earth was she doing there? Had John invited her? If so, why? Yoko introduced herself to the group, then sat silent and motionless throughout, taking no part in the proceedings. John chatted to the other Beatles and the Maharishi's assistant and appeared not to notice her. My mind was racing. Was he in regular contact with this woman? What on earth was going on? At the end of the evening, Anthony was waiting outside for us. He opened the car door, and to my astonishment, Yoko climbed in ahead of us. John gave me a look that intimated that he didn't know what the hell was going on. Shrugging, palms upturned, nonplussed, he leaned and asked if we could give her a lift somewhere. "Oh, yes, please. 25 Hanover Gate," Yoko replied. We climbed in, and not another word was said until we dropped her off, when she said, "Goodbye, thank you," and got out. "How bizarre," I said to John. "What was that all about?" "Search me, Cyn. He insisted he hadn't invited Yoko and knew nothing of her being there, but common sense dictated that it had to have been John who had asked her to come. Whatever my doubts, though, it was clear that he wasn't going to provide an explanation." On February the 16th, we flew out with George, Patty and her sister Jenny and Magic Alex. The plan was to stay for 10 weeks, so Mum had moved into our house to look after Julian, and although I hated leaving him, I knew he'd be happy with her and Dot. In India, I hoped that John and I would grow closer, but we weren't having the second honeymoon I'd expected. John was becoming increasingly cold and aloof towards me. He would get up early and leave our room. He spoke to me very little, and after a week or two he announced that he wanted to move into a separate room to give himself more space. From then on he virtually ignored me, both in private and in public. If the others noticed, they didn't say so. I did my best to understand, begging him to explain what was wrong. He fobbed me off, telling me that it was just the effect of the meditation. I can't feel normal doing all this stuff, he said. I'm trying to get myself together. It's nothing to do with you. Give me a break. What I didn't know was that each morning he rushed down to the post office to see if he had a letter from Yoko. She was writing to him almost daily. When I learnt this later, I felt very hurt. There was I, trying to give John the space and understanding he asked for, with no idea that Yoko was drawing him away from me and further into her orbit. After a month, Paul and Jane had had enough and decided to go home. John and I, with George and Patty, wanted to stay. Aside from my troubles with John, I got a great deal from being there. I loved the serenity of the place and still hoped that John would work through his demons and move back to me. In the absence of the true explanation, I put his aloofness down to a bout of intense self-exploration and hoped that it would ultimately be good for him and for us. A couple of weeks before we were due to leave, Magic Alex accused the Maharishi of behaving improperly with a young American girl, who was a fellow student. Without allowing the Maharishi an opportunity to defend himself, John and George chose to believe Alex and decided we must all leave. I was upset, maligned. I had seen Alex with the girl, who was young and impressionable, and I wondered whether he, whom I'd never once seen meditating, was being rather mischievous. I was surprised that John and George had both chosen to believe him. It was only when John and I talked later that he told me he had begun to feel disenchanted with the Maharishi's behaviour. He felt that, for a spiritual man, the Maharishi had too much interest in public recognition, celebrities and money. The journey home was long and grim. I was close to tears, and John was paranoid, afraid that the Maharishi would take his revenge on us in some way. We planned to spend a night in Delhi, but the hotel was full, and Alex had discovered that if we hurried we could make the night flight to London. I hated the rush, which seemed unnecessary, but with the others setting the pace we hit the road and just made the flight. Sad as I was at the way the Indian trip had ended, it was wonderful to hold Julian again, shower him with kisses, sit in the kitchen with a cup of tea, catching up on the news with Mum and Dot. We had brought Julian back 6 little Indian outfits and some delicate hand-carved wooden soldiers, gifts from the Maharishi for his 5th birthday, a few days earlier. He looked adorable in his Indian clothes and was thrilled to have Mum and Dad at home. Back at Kenwood, John continued to be distant toward me. Now that we were away from the others and the charms of India, I felt increasingly afraid and depressed. John and I were back in the same bed, but the warmth and passion we had shared for so long were absent. John seemed barely to notice me. He was little better with Julian and was more likely to snap at him than give him a hug. There was just one moment of real warmth between us, and that was, ironically, when John confessed to me that he had been unfaithful. We were in the kitchen when he said out of the blue, "There have been other women, you know, Cyn." I was taken aback, but touched by his honesty. "That's okay," I told him. He came over to where I was standing beside the sink and put his arms round me. "You're the only one I've ever loved, Cyn," he said, and kissed me. "I still love you, and I always will."